So, hi everyone. Welcome to the Ask Me Anything with Dr. Agarwal. I'm Dr. Pooja Agarwal. I use she, her pronouns. I am so honored that you're here joining me today to literally ask me anything. And I received more than 200 registrations for today, which is amazing. I received more than 50 questions through the Zoom registration. And if you go to slido.com, there you can see all of the questions. I kind of took the 50 and tried to categorize them and summarize them a bit. So you can go to slido.com, #retrieve, and I encourage you to upvote the questions that are the most interesting and pertinent to you. Slido is also a tech tool I use in my classrooms that I mentioned in my newsletter, and I use the free version. I'm not paid by Slido. I don't know them. It's just a free tool similar to Poll Everywhere and Mentimeter. That's a little bit different than Kahoot. And I find that Slido works well for K-12 and higher ed. So thank you for sharing what you teach and where you are located. We are going to jump right in. So again, my name is Dr. Pooja Agarwal. I use she, her pronouns. I am a cognitive scientist. I've been conducting research on how students learn for 20 years. I'm also a teacher. I'm a professor in Boston at the Berklee College of Music in Boston, where I teach psychology and neuroscience to musicians. I am not a musician myself, but I love teaching science and neuroscience to musicians. I've also written 2 books, Powerful Teaching, and my new book, new-ish, that came out in April, Smart Teaching, Stronger Learning, that I hope you'll check out. You're all newsletter subscribers, so of course you're familiar with my website, and I hope you'll follow me on social media. I've got hundreds of downloads on my website, and I do hope you'll share that with colleagues and friends. First up with Slido, I already have a poll for you. This is an open text Slido poll to type in, how do you already use retrieval practice in your teaching, in your classrooms, in your coaching? So in this, oh, sorry. So in this way, oh, my apologies. Give me just a moment. I'm not sure why it did that. That's very odd. Give me just a moment. But I think the Slido is still active, I hope. I don't know why it's showing blue. My apologies. So in terms of how you already use retrieval practice, this is wide open in terms of how you use it for a variety of ages and content areas. There again is the QR code. Excuse me. And you can go to slido.com #retrieve. And we can see 4 participants are typing in. And in the top right of your screen, if you're looking at the Zoom screen, you'll see the number of people who have typed in so far. So that's a great way to monitor how things are going for students in your class, or you can see how many are typing and how many have responded so far. So take a moment to type in and add how you already use retrieval practice. And we will mainly be using Slido today. You're welcome to interact in the chat box as well, but it'll be helpful if you have any questions to add them to Slido. So using Poll Everywhere to ask the last class what they remember and tying it into other topics. Poll Everywhere is very similar to Slido. I honestly don't remember why I specifically started using Slido and what the differences are from Poll Everywhere. So if you'd like to add to the chat how Slido interacts or has a bit of a different interface than Poll Everywhere, please do type that in. Brain dumps, I see you're already using brain dumps as well. Asking questions and pausing that think time. Of course, I've written about how we tend to skip the think step in the think, pair, share. So make sure you're providing that kind of awkward silence to help students retrieve as well. And I promise my 16-year-old dog will make an appearance. She is here asleep on the floor next to me. So when she wakes up, I will bring her over to join us here on the Zoom. Let's see. In math class, I love that we have a wonderful mix, and same with the questions. I got questions related to kindergartners all the way through medical school, from content areas ranging from physics and biology to literature, writing, and reading. So, really thinking through how these strategies like retrieval practice, spacing, interleaving, metacognition apply for all ages and all content areas is something I love to do and I love to troubleshoot with. Now, on Slido, if you have this pulled up in a web browser or on a mobile phone, you can see that there's a tab for the Q&A. So you'll see kind of a tab for the polls that you're completing now, and there's the tab for the Q&A. So I will switch to that. And you can see the questions pop up here on the screen. They pop up on the projector for my students. I have this embedded in my Google Slides. So while you're there, take a moment to look through questions and upvote them. I received more than 50 questions for our Ask Me Anything. I kind of condensed them a bit into 30 questions, and it's really helpful to see the upvotes, especially whether it's a classroom of 20 people or a large class of 150 people. It's always nice to get to the questions that pertain to most everyone. So you can continue typing in questions and upvoting, but I am going to highlight a question to get us started. So how can I engage teachers in research who always say they are too busy? We are all busy. I'm a teacher with 85 students. I can totally empathize when teachers say, gee, I'd really like to do research. I'm just too busy and I have too much on my plate. One thing I love reinforcing and validating teachers with is that they already do research in their classroom. Everyone on this Zoom, I promise, is already doing research. When you're playing around with the best way to hook students into a new topic, when you create a new activity and you're not sure how long it takes, and so you adjust that over time, that's all conducting research, is simply trying things out in an ideally somewhat systematic way and seeing how it works. So I think a first step when teachers are nervous about engaging in research or they're busy is to just point out that they're already doing research. They're already doing research. And so what is it that they maybe want to focus on a little bit more? If they've already got their activity timing down, can they just play around with Slido by asking one or two more questions? Are they comfortable playing around with throwing in a brain dump or two? Sometimes I think the idea of research and science sounds overwhelming and scary. In my intro psychology class just yesterday, I had students talking about the research and experiments they're conducting, and I had two students just say like, oh my gosh, I don't remember what the dependent variable was or what we measured because that's too scientific. And I was able to say, well, aside from the jargon of a dependent variable, what is it you ultimately hope to find out? And she had said, well, we want to see if these stress management strategies improve happiness. I said, great. So how are you determining if people are happier? And she said, well, we're giving them a Google Form survey. And I said, there you go. That's it. That's how you're measuring your outcome for your experiment. So by validating teachers that they're already doing research, encouraging them to just do a tiny little bit of maybe a question that they can play around with implementation. And then the next steps might be, all right, if you want to do something more formal, what would you like to compare and contrast or manipulate or change or that independent variable? And what would you like to measure? I have more tips on how to conduct research at retrievalpractice.org/research. So if you can type that in, I'll also try to put it in the chat. If you all have been in one of my Zoom parties before, you know that I call this multi-failing, where I try to type things in. There we go. So retrievalpractice.org/research. And again, if you have questions, please add them to the Slido. There's the QR code. If you go to slido.com #retrieve, if you add the questions there, then everyone has the opportunity to upvote them. So if you have questions instead of the chat, please put them on Slido, but feel free to interact in the chat as well. So thank you for that question. I see the next one that's upvoted 4 times. What are your thoughts on using AI as a learning collaborator? Okay, AI is a big thing. I see smiles. I have students who want to use AI. I have preferences about when they do and don't use it. I think AI can be a collaborator. I'll give you that example again of my student in intro psychology who is just really struggling with wrapping her head around the experiment that she's conducting. She could type into ChatGPT or an AI tool and say, I'm working on stress management tools to see if they make people happier. What's my independent and dependent variable? And hopefully, maybe AI would be correct in explaining what her independent and dependent variables are. Excuse me. And to me, that's using AI as a learning collaborator. And then the student could check in with me. And in some ways, to me, that's also helpful because in a classroom of 30 students, I could literally say, see what ChatGPT says, and I'll be right back. And I can go help another student and come back. So using AI as a learning collaborator during class, I find very helpful. Understandably, using AI as a learning collaborator while completing quizzes or homework outside of class can get a bit dicey. The way I explain it with my college students is that they're allowed to use AI to support their learning, but not to replace their learning. And we talked through the distinctions of what it means for AI to support their learning compared to what it means to replace their learning. So giving a prompt to ChatGPT, like, I don't understand what my variables are, to me, that's supporting a student's learning. Replacing a student's learning would be, dear ChatGPT, come up with an experiment that I could run the entire semester and collect data and tell me what the results would be. That's replacing a student's learning because they're not engaging in that material. So I think AI is here to stay. Students are going to use it, and there are ways we can have conversations with students about what it means and how to do it. I've also, excuse me, in my newsletter, wow, this isn't working anymore. There we go. My multi-failing in Zoom. I've written about how to use AI with retrieval practice. I think that link works if you go to retrievalpractice.org/AI. Those are prompts I have about how to engage students in retrieval practice with questions that AI can't necessarily answer. So what is an example of accommodation and assimilation from childhood development related to a kid you babysat? That would be kind of hard for ChatGPT to create a specific situation to a specific kid. Or what's an example related to your favorite TV show about parenting styles? What's an example of a time when you couldn't sleep and when you did an experiment to help yourself sleep better? So at retrievalpractice.org/AI, I've got some tips on how to incorporate that as well. How am I doing? How's this going? I've never done an Ask Me Anything on Zoom, so this feels kind of weird. Thank you. Okay, I see nods and smiles and thumbs up. Again, let me know if you have questions in Slido. And I recognize a few of you. Hi, Annie. Nice to see you. And a few others here as well. So thanks for joining me. I see 6 upvotes for this question. Are there differences in how to implement these strategies for different content areas like physics, literature, writing, etc.? Yeah, I got a number of questions about this, so I kind of condensed them into this. For example, one person pointed out a lot of the books I recommend, I've got a list at retrievalpractice.org/books. A lot of them, my books, Powerful Teaching, Smart Teaching, Stronger Learning, Make It Stick, Small Teaching, Ace That Test, they're all General in that they don't have specific strategies for specific content areas. The reason being that a ton of research has been conducted on so many different content areas, and retrieval practice, spacing, interleaving improve learning, long-term learning for students for any content area. Which is kind of counterintuitive. There's so many different ways to teach English language from teaching physics. Practice problems for physics probably look very different than practice problems for biology. But this core underlying principle of how learning works applies to learning from driving a car to remembering what mitosis is. So the simple idea of a brain dump or free recall, having students write down everything they can remember, students can write down everything they can remember from learning about basic physics principles and gravity, or doing a brain dump about the novel they just read for class. So there honestly aren't, I mentioned this in a recent newsletter, there's no sort of perfect recipe for specific content areas. One aspect I recommend thinking about is if you teach a sort of skills-based course, procedural content with steps. So in calculus, for example, or in math, certain steps students have to follow. That's where interleaving can be very helpful. Once students are familiar with an order of steps, depending on your content area, then have students mix up the order of steps. For example, at the Berklee College of Music, where I teach, there's a professor, many professors who teach ear training, helping students understand what they hear and identify the notes and pitches. And my colleague of mine, Dr. Leslie Ann Harrison, teaches students steps to go through for ear training. They first listen to the sounds, they take staff notation, rhythmic notation, they do some shorthand, and they check their answers. I'm not a musician, but that's my best understanding. And once the students understand these specific steps for ear training, then Dr. Harrison mixes up the order. So she says, instead of starting with shorthand, let's start with rhythmic notation. And then let's skip to a different step in the sequence. So that's one thing that can be content specific. Another one I've talked about is if there are a lot of specific concrete terms, like the names of musical composers, the names of painters, key terms and vocabulary words from chemistry. Those words can be interleaved. If you think about a flashcard deck, simply shuffling it up. So there are certain strategies that I think are more applicable for certain content areas, but you can really use interleaving to have students remember different chapters of a book in different orders for a literature class. Or if there are different approaches to creative writing, space out some retrieval practice later on, ask them what some of those steps were, and try to cover them, go over that content or discuss that content in different orders. So there really isn't much strategy-wise to content areas. I do see the question about the majority of research. The majority of research on retrieval practice and these learning strategies has been conducted with psychology classes and STEM classes. And part of that is just because of the logistics of research and the convenience samples. With those of us who conduct psychology research, we teach psychology classes. And so as part of those psychology classes, students participate in experiments for course credit, or we pay them $5, $10, or $15 per hour. So that's why psychology professors conduct research on sort of psychology students. It's also easier in some ways for STEM professors to include research in their classes when it's a large lecture class, or in my classes of 20 students. But there has been a growing amount of research on retrieval practice in literature, English language arts, even in spelling. There's a really cool study on rainbow spelling if you teach young kids. So there's growing research in a lot of content areas, and we need more of it. So for that earlier question of how can you get teachers involved in research, please encourage them to play around with these strategies, especially in areas that are not STEM classes. My colleagues and I published a literature review that was now a while ago. There we go. If you go to retrievalpractice.org/review, there you can download our literature review. We looked at 2,000 research articles on retrieval practice. There's a whole downloadable spreadsheet, which I still refer to all the time. So you can download not only our journal article, but we have a spreadsheet organized of 50 experiments where you can sort by content area. So if you're looking for research related to a specific content area you teach, download that spreadsheet, play around with it. You can sort by the grade level, the content area, the type of exams, the year it was published, all kinds of different things. So please do check out retrievalpractice.org/review. And again, in that literature review, we found that retrieval practice improved learning for all content areas for a wide variety of them. So thank you for that question. As a reminder, again, you can go to slido.com #retrieve and do upvote the questions. There are 33 of them, as you can see me scrolling on the screen. So it's really helpful to know which ones you're most interested in, because we've already been here for 20 minutes and I'm not even sure if I can get through all of these. So please do upvote the ones that are most interesting to you. What are some ways to integrate retrieval practice in asynchronous online courses and self-paced learning materials? This one I need to think more about. One of the things I do that sort of functions as asynchronous material is the homework my students complete. So I teach college students, and I teach intro psychology classes, cognitive psychology, and social psychology. And in all of my classes, students have mini quizzes that are Google Forms that they complete outside of class. They're only worth 3% of students' grades. To get a little nitty-gritty, my students complete 12 of them throughout the semester. They're worth 3% of their grade, and I drop the lowest 2 grades. So if there's a week where a student doesn't do the reading, they're out sick, they're traveling, they're out of town, I still drop the lowest 2 grades on those retrieval practices. So anyway, this is what happens with the Ask Me Anythings in my classes where I just digress. So back to this question about async online courses and self-paced learning materials. These Google Forms my students complete take them at least half an hour to an hour. And they have spaced out questions. So, for example, what do you remember about our conversation about correlation and causation last week would be a spaced retrieval question. And then I also have embedded YouTube videos. I personally use the Crash Course YouTube series. If anyone uses Crash Course, if you could type it in the chat, I'm curious. The Crash Course video series, yeah, I see Steve does. They've got them for all kinds of different content areas. And at least for psychology, they're pretty good, surprisingly engaging, pretty reliable. They don't include misleading information or misconceptions. So in my async Google Forms, these mini quizzes, students watch about 20 minutes worth of lectures and answer questions about them. And this ties into AI, where this week my unit is on neuroscience in the brain. Students have to watch 2 crash course videos on neuroscience. And then I ask them, for example, in this video, the host discusses 3 parts of the brain. Which part is the most interesting to you and why? Now, a student could copy and paste that into ChatGPT, but I know which 3 parts of the brain are mentioned in the crash course video. So if a student responds with, oh, I really want to know more about the hippocampus, that's great, but the crash course video never mentioned the hippocampus. So there's a way with async materials, if you're going to put in lecture videos, for example, or it's self-paced, thinking through the kind of questions you ask can take some extra work, especially with AI nowadays. But all of my async material always includes retrieval questions. During the pandemic, I know a lot of colleagues recorded themselves and used those lectures. I chose not to. I enjoyed more conversation on Zoom with my students, so that's why I use the crash course videos. But it's still similar to async materials with lectures and questions about the lectures. I also like with the Google Forms, I will structure them sometimes with a multiple choice question. So for example, when my students watched a crash course video about sleep, research on sleep, why do we sleep, what are its benefits, I did ask them which of the crash course video mentioned 4 benefits of sleep. Which of these 4 benefits is the most surprising to you? So they select one out of the 4, and in Google Forms, it creates an automatic pie chart that then I can copy. If you go to the tab that says responses, you scroll down to the question, and I think there's a copy chart button. And if you paste that into Google Slides, it shows the pie chart. And so what's nice is I can show that pie chart to my class. Oh, this is benefit 2 was the one that was most surprising. But then the question on the Google form next is, why do you think that benefit was the most surprising? Tell me more about what was surprising about it. So now ChatGPT doesn't know which benefit the student selected, and I can tell, is their reasoning consistent with the benefit they selected? And then my Google Forms, I call them retrieval practices, but the Google Forms are due 24 hours before class. And I emphasize to students, again, this is async material, but then that way the 24 hours gives me time to look through their responses and I can highlight them in class. So here's a pie chart of the 4 benefits of sleep that were most surprising. I noticed on the retrieval practice that Tanya had this great reasoning for why informational processing was the most surprising for her. Or Alex had mentioned that the hormonal physical benefits of sleep was the most surprising for them. And then that gives us a richer discussion. So I think with async courses, it's similar to synchronous courses, but it's actually a nice way to get students engaging with material. And then if you meet synchronously, is to jump right into, I saw Taylor mention this thing. Taylor, would you be open to talking more about it? And all of the questions on async can just be retrieval, whether it's based from previous classes, from the lectures they're watching, or from the reading. So my students read a short book. Depending on the class, they read 1 chapter a week. And I might say, there were a lot of examples in chapter 2. Which one really stood out to you and why? ChatGPT doesn't know what the examples were necessarily. And if you ask ChatGPT for summaries of books, it's really bad. So when I say which example in chapter 2 was the most interesting to you, I know what the examples were. And that helps me gauge if students completed the async material and demonstrated their understanding. So that was long-winded, but I hope that was helpful in thinking through async material. Next one, let's see. What do you think is the single most effective but underused strategies teachers can apply to improve student learning? I looked at these questions, but I promise I didn't go through and prep them. So it's still the fun ask me anything vibe that I do with my students. What's the single most effective but underused strategy? I mean, as you all know, I would say retrieval practice, getting information out of students' heads instead of just getting it into their heads. But I'm preaching to the choir here. So I would say probably spacing. We might have a tendency to use retrieval practice as an exit ticket or at the end of class. What's your key takeaway from class today? Which is great. Research shows that's going to improve students' learning, but the spacing component can be harder for us to use, or it can be underused. I think one, because we just literally forget ourselves as teachers to come back to that question. And 2, it can take a little bit of planning. So I've gotten really good, frankly, at just throwing in Slido questions this semester. I mentioned in my newsletter about this Ask Me Anything. With Slido in the middle of class, if my students are doing a think, pair, share and they're discussing, it really only takes me 5 minutes to insert a Slido poll or an open text question. And so in the middle of class, to just break things up, I can say, what do you remember from our conversation about the illusion of confidence? My students are like, whoa, whoa, what are you talking about? I'm like, oh, we talked about it. We watched a video of a con artist. We watched a video about the halo effect. So I'll give them little retrieval cues and let them ponder it and then respond on Slido. So the planning for me in terms of spacing feels less. I can just literally think of or look at my lesson plans. What did we talk about last week or the prior week? I can create a quick Slido poll. You could do this with index cards, is to just throw out one of these spaced retrieval questions, have them write it down on an index card. I always talk about them constantly, though I realized I've never written a newsletter just about index cards, so I might need to do that. But if students write down a question on an index card, they can shuffle them up, they can pass them around to each other. You can collect them and pass them to a different class, which is a fun activity. Um, anyway, but using spacing, I think, is underused. An entry ticket is great. What do you remember from our previous class? I do that as well. But really trying to encourage students, what do you remember from 3 weeks ago when we talked about differences between the Iliad and the Odyssey? And you might have students have a little feeling of deer in headlights the more you space things out. But reassuring them that forgetting is normal will help with including more spacing into your teaching. I think my previous newsletter featured Dr. Shanna Carpenter, who is one of the contributors for our new book, Smart Teaching, Stronger Learning, about how there is no optimal recipe for spacing, which can be disappointing for some people and unsatisfying, but I think exciting for other people, including me, where it just gives us the freedom to throw in retrieval questions without trying to adhere to a specific number of times or specific spacing out over time. So I encourage you to use spacing and think about how you can include it with just index cards or questions, because I think it is underused. What do I think about Bloom's taxonomy? Bloom's taxonomy is fascinating. It makes sense why it's caught on since the 1970s. It's simple. There's an easy triangle, which that whole triangle diagram was actually never in the original Bloom's taxonomy papers. Fun fact. I did my dissertation on Bloom's taxonomy. It took me 9 years to publish my dissertation. But if you go to retrievalpractice.org/blooms, again, please correct me in the chat if that's not the correct link. Um, with Bloom's taxonomy, I phrase this as a chicken or an egg. Oftentimes people think we have to start at the bottom of the triangle, the knowledge base, before we can work up to evaluation, synthesis, analysis, creation. But I think I wanted to know if it's a chicken or an egg problem. Can't we just stop at the top with asking students critical thinking questions? And so I used retrieval practice in my research. That study was done with college students in the laboratory and sixth graders in a public school near St. Louis. And with the retrieval practice, sometimes the questions were basic questions like, what is a welfare system in the United States? What does it provide? That's kind of a basic knowledge question. And with the college students for the welfare topic, I would ask them, well, you read an article about the pros and cons, or an author that supports welfare systems and an author who doesn't support welfare systems. If they were to go on welfare, if they needed that social service, based on what you read, how do you think they would react? Which is a bit more complicated if you had read the article, not just, yes, I would accept welfare, or no, I wouldn't. It was a bit more complex, which is why it made for a great higher order thinking question. So sometimes on the retrieval practice, students would get basic questions, and sometimes they would get these really complicated, complex questions, even for sixth graders. How does World War II compare to World War I? For sixth graders, that's kind of a big question, different from why did World War II start? And my research showed that a mix of questions was the best at promoting students' performance on a higher order test. So of course we know that transfer is hard. Transfer is not something students or humans do naturally. If we give students practice with the types of questions we ultimately want them to be able to complete, then they'll be able to complete those questions. But just starting at the bottom of the pyramid and slowly working our way up Bloom's taxonomy will not necessarily get students to where we want them to be as critical thinkers with higher order complex learning. So long story short, Bloom's taxonomy is great. It serves a purpose, but we don't have to start at the bottom. We can start at the top. And I think that's a good thing to give us that flexibility again. Next, let's see. How do you teach students to grasp skills like finding the main idea and summarizing text? Yeah. So I teach science. I think my strategy applies for literature classes and creative writing as well. When my students are reading their book, again, it's a short chapter. I have them here, but it'd be kind of hard for me to get them off my bookshelf. When students read a chapter, I encourage them to not take notes. They don't take notes while they're reading in my class, and my class is a safe space to forget and to try to retrieve. So when they're reading, and this is based on my very first publication, if you go to, I've never written about it in my newsletter, but if you go to, let's see, poojaagrawal.com/research, I've got all of my publications available for free, yay, free, as PDFs. My very first publication looked at open book and closed book retrieval practice. And there I looked at what happens if students read and take notes at the same time, if students read, take notes, and complete an open book exam, or read without notes, then retrieve, and then take an exam. And I found that when students engaged in the note-taking condition, the simultaneous answering, I think is what I called it 20 years ago, when you're taking notes while reading, you're kind of multi-failing. It helps you stay on track, but you're not necessarily ingesting or encoding what you're reading. Especially for our students, they might just be writing notes of vocabulary words from a textbook or writing verbatim a sentence. So with my students, when they're reading and I want them to understand and find the main idea, I tell them just read the chapter. And when you're done with the chapter, write down two things that stood out to you. What are two key points from the chapter? What are two examples? What are two things that you think the authors really wanted you to understand? And if my students can pick out two things from a chapter that takes them 30 minutes to read, to me, they've picked up on the main idea. And to me, the main idea can differ for different students. That's part of the fun of reading, is we don't necessarily all gain the exact same knowledge from the exact same chapter. So I really love the two things approach that I mention in my newsletter all the time. If you'd like a refresher, you can go to retrievalpractice.org/two things. It's just retrieving two things. It could be three things, four things. I like the simplicity and the alliteration. Of course, you could do this with a brain dump after students read, is to have them not summarize the text from notes, but to free recall and brain dump what they read. And then consider that a summary. Even if it feels like it's kind of meandering and it's not a cohesive paragraph summary, I think it's richer to look at what students have summarized in their own heads. And research shows that free recall, brain dumps, actually helps students organize the knowledge in their heads. If you've ever had the experience where you're retrieving something and then it takes a second and you're like, oh yeah, this other thing. Oh yeah, this other thing. That happens with brain dumps and free recall. So as students literally brain dump, my colleagues have shown that their topics and their concepts start to kind of become grouped. And if you wanted to, you could have students read, not take notes, do a brain dump, and then organize their brain dump. And to me, I would find that to be a beneficial summary for their long-term learning than just read the chapter and now summarize what was in the chapter. So in that way, it could take more time, and I know we're all time limited in class as well, but I hope that that's a helpful way for students to fully understand main ideas, rather than just this kind of plug and chug of I'm reading, I'm taking notes, and I'm going to summarize it. Thanks for that. Um, Yes, I think this is in the chat. Do you think we get in too big of a hurry and lead our students into multi-failing? Yes. Absolutely. We want them talking, we want them engaged, we want the pair and share. And then sometimes I do this all the time. I say something to my students, they're pair and sharing, and then I'm like, oh, wait, and here's this other thing. And then now they're distracted because they're thinking of the other thing and they've lost their train of thought. We need to give them time to think and to write and to brain dump and then to move on to the next thing, and then to move on to the next thing. Another thing I've never written about is just literally how I structure discussions. The question my students are answering is always on my slide on the projector. Yesterday, for example, I showed students a headline and we were discussing misleading headlines, how you might see something like blueberries improves memory, a study says, and that sounds so official. And I want my students to think critically. Just because it says a study says doesn't mean that's a good study. So I showed them a headline and I asked them two questions. What's your initial reaction? And what's something you want to know more about this study? I always have those questions on my slide, always. And for students, it's fun for me to just see how often they look up at the projector and they look back at their partner, and they look up at the projector and they look at their partner, because they're not multi-failing. This plays into working memory. I've published research on it, but haven't talked a lot about it in my 10 years of my newsletter. Where working memory, we're juggling information in our heads. We can only do so much of that as human beings. This is why two-factor authentication is really annoying when you log into a website and you get texted 35126, 35126, and you have to remember that number and type it into a website. Imagine students remembering two discussion prompts in their head. They need a list at the front of the board, and that will help them not multi-fail. I love talking about multi-failing. One of these days, I kind of want to write a book just called Multi-Failing, and I hope it would take off, but I think that would be a really fun book to write, at least a newsletter on that. Next, should class discussion be graded or ungraded? I say ungraded. That's my short, simple answer, ungraded. I used to grade participation. There was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed by James Lang, the author of Small Teaching, which is also a great book about the science of learning. James Lang is a professor of English literature, and the Chronicle of Higher Ed can be paywalled. So you can do some searching to find this article. And I don't remember the title, but the whole article is about why we shouldn't grade participation. And that article by James Lang just convinced me to stop grading participation. For a combination of students who don't feel comfortable speaking up in class, um, equity issues, the students who speak the most often and speak the loudest are very different than the students who speak the least often. There's a lot of research on demographic differences between male students speaking up more frequently than female students, for example. So that affecting students' grades. It increasing students' anxiety to participate, grading the participation might lead to like kind of meh responses because students are just saying stuff to get a grade. So I actually don't grade students on participation or attendance at all. I realize in college classrooms, I have more autonomy to be able to do that. What I do instead is those retrieval practices I mentioned, my Google Forms or mini quizzes. That's where I ask students, what's an example we discussed in class of the serial position effect that really stood out to you? Students know that I'm going to ask those questions, so they're not gotcha questions. If a student was in class and listening and maybe participating, they should be able to answer that question. My slides are always available for students as well. So if they're absent, they can look at the slides, they can see the examples. But I don't put students on the spot to share with the whole class. I just finished, I could get the book, I could see it right there. I just finished the book, well, sorry, James Lang. So in the chat, if you look up James Lang, he's the author of Small Teaching, and he's a frequent contributor to the Chronicle of Higher Ed. And his article literally was about why you shouldn't grade participation. So do check out his work. Actually, on YouTube, I think I had a Zoom party with James Lang, and another author, Michelle Miller, and I put it up on YouTube so you can see an interaction of us discussing his new book, Write Like You Teach, and discussing my book and Michelle Miller's books. But James Lang is great, so check out all of his materials. Oh, okay. So I just finished a book called Inclusive Teaching. Inclusive Teaching by Kelly Hogan and Viji Sathi. I got to meet them in Boston, which was very exciting. So I got my book autographed from them. And they have some great discussion strategies to help everyone feel like they belong and they're inclusive without being put on the spot. So one of them I've already implemented, again, it's ungraded, is when I have students, let's see, with this example about the misleading headline, when I have students think and then pair and share what they'd like to know more about from this headline. I used to say, who would like to share? And I would have different pairs raise their hand to share with the whole class. Now I say, if you would like to share what you'd like to know more about, or if you'd like to share your initial reaction, just give me like, raise your hand by like chest level. Just raise your hand down here. And I can quickly scan the room and I tell them, I'm going to wait till I see at least 4 hands, which feels really awkward. I've never done this before, but my students are going along with it. So I'll say, if you would like to share, raise your hand. And then when I see at least 4 hands, I can then call on pairs who have maybe not spoken up before. And that way I'm not only calling on the first pair who raises their hand, and sometimes I'll still say, who haven't we heard from who would like to share? But I really like this approach of waiting for 4 hands or 3 or 2 hands, because then also people aren't put on the spot. They have a moment to think, do I want to share? Maybe I don't. And so I think class discussion can be hard to facilitate, um, hard for students, and anxiety provoking. So I would prefer to grade students individually based on their out of class assignments rather than in class. Another book, sorry, all my books are right behind me, but I can't grab them. Another book by James Lang I absolutely adore is called On Course by James Lang. It's an oldie but goodie, and I don't think it's gone out of style. He maybe wrote it now 20 years ago. But there's a whole chapter in On Course on discussion strategies. There's, I mean, multiple guides from the Chronicle of Higher Ed on discussion strategies, which also reminds me, again, I digress with the Ask Me Anythings. I think K-12 and higher ed need to have a party. Like, we all need to learn from each other. I think K-12 is really innovative, and honestly, I think higher ed needs to pay more attention to K-12. No offense to those of you who are college and university professors. K-12 teachers are doing really amazing things. And in higher ed, we're doing much better. There are now teaching centers at colleges and universities, but a lot of it still sits in separate spaces. So if you're in K-12, check out the discussion guide, the guides about class discussions from the Chronicle of Higher Ed. Kelly Hogan and Viji Sathi had a guide about inclusive teaching from the Chronicle of Higher Ed. And for those in the higher ed level, my favorite K-12 go-to sources is Cult of Pedagogy with Jennifer Gonzalez and Matt Miller with Ditch That Textbook. So if you haven't heard of any of those, again, if you're in K-12, definitely check out the Chronicle of Higher Ed. Check out James Lang. He's got a Substack. Michelle Miller's got a Substack. Books by Sarah Kavanaugh, Dr. Sarah Kavanaugh. Sarah Kavanaugh. Um, and of course, my new book, Smart Teaching, Stronger Learning, has 10 chapters from 10 different college professors, but all written with strategies adaptable for K-12. If you're looking for really great ideas from K-12 people, again, that's Jennifer Gonzalez's Cult to Pedagogy and Matt Miller's Ditch That Textbook. We were recently featured, I was featured with my colleagues on Cult to Pedagogy about 2 chapters from Smart Teaching, Stronger Learning. She just put out her interview with Dr. Kripa Sundar about how to use concept maps effectively for retrieval practice, not just for short-term learning. And then back in April, we were on Cult of Pedagogy with Dr. Janelle Blunt and Dr. Michelle Rivers from the new book, talking about whiteboards and name tents and questions du jour. So you'll have to check those out from Cult of Pedagogy as well. Smart Teaching, Stronger Learning is currently available. It's available in paperback and on Kindle. It should be available throughout the world, as well as from independent bookstores and non-Amazon sources. And y'all are the first to know that it will be available in audiobook soon. I am working on that behind the scenes. I've had a number of teachers say, why isn't it an audiobook? I listen to books on my commute. So I'm excited to let you all know there will be an audiobook version soon, and I'm working on it. If you have any trouble getting access to it, please feel free to email me at ask@retrievalpractice.org, and I can help track down what's going on if you can't get access to it. I have more information about the book at retrievalpractice.org/smart teaching. Teaching. There you go. So do check it out there too. For my new book, you can download the introduction for free. You can download a list of tips from the book for free. There's 10 tips, 1 tip from each of the chapters. It's only 10 chapters, 10 pages each, because I wanted to keep it really short. So it is about a third of the size of Powerful Teaching, in case that helps. It's very tiny, so I hope you'll check it out. I'm very, very proud of Smart Teaching, Stronger Learning. Okay, gosh, there's only like half an hour left, and I got through barely any questions, so I'll go a little faster. How can you use retrieval practice when students need to study a huge amount of material? First of all, forgetting happens. Students are going to forget, especially huge amounts of material. It's really hard to remember all that material. Validating teachers and students that they're going to forget, I think, is helpful and disappointing. So, I mean, that's my first thing to say is we can help students study a huge amount of material, but they're going to forget, and forgetting's normal. We have to tell them that they're going to forget, and forgetting's normal. Otherwise, with a huge amount of material, of course, retrieval helps. Research shows that students have a tendency to study what they know best because that's their comfort zone. And students should ideally take a look at studying what's kind of in the middle, what they kind of get right, kind of get wrong. Specifically, and this is based mostly on laboratory research, some research suggests that students should retrieve an item of information at least 3 times before dropping it out of their flashcard deck. So for example, if you teach medical students or college students who use Anki or Quizlet for flashcards, I don't remember how the algorithms work, but you should encourage students to correctly retrieve an item at least 3 times before dropping it or before moving on to before not studying at all. What happens is students might retrieve something once correct and think, I got it, I know it, but that could have been a lucky guess. That could have just been in the moment they remembered it, but it hasn't solidified in their long-term learning. So making sure students with a huge amount of material, of course, there are time trade-offs, but also if they really want to get good at a subset of that, encourage them to retrieve multiple times as much as possible, rather than just kind of once or twice. How do you check for understanding at the end of a lesson? Most recently, again, since I've been adding in Slido more frequently, what's a key takeaway? Why is it memorable for you? So recently, my students and I talked about research on emotion, how we have emotions, why we have emotions, how our physical body responses affect our emotions, how our emotions affect our physical body. And I asked them, what are your key takeaways? And I got this like wonderful list of pretty much everything we talked about. Because students can see it all here on the screen, whether I'm online or in person, it's a really nice way for students to just kind of see a whole list of what everyone else remembered. And it's just a nice way for them to see literally all the points we just covered. Um, so an exit ticket, I use Slido. You could use index cards. You could jot down something on a piece of scrap paper and have students recycle it. I mean, this happened so many times this week when I used index cards and students are always like, "Do you need this?" Like, no, I'm not grading it. And it's still like, it still shocks them that I'm not grading any of this. But it does help me check for understanding. Another thing is also that I've noticed that we tend to get very nervous when students make mistakes. More retrieval practice is going to increase the number of mistakes students make. That's a good thing. We learn from our mistakes. So if at the end of a lesson you're checking for students' understanding and there's a bunch of misunderstandings, that's okay. Research shows that retrieving, even without feedback, improves learning for correct information. So if you check for understanding at the end of a lesson and it's not quite where you want it to, that could be a good opportunity for spacing the next time you have a lesson. Okay, when it comes to spacing, how much time needs to pass in order to ensure information sticks? There is no perfect amount. Sorry. No perfect amount. You do you. It really just depends on your content, your classroom, the age of your students, because you know your classroom and students best. So there is no optimal amount of time it needs to pass. Ideally, and this was in my newsletter with Dr. Shanna Carpenter, it should feel like a challenge, but not too much of a challenge. Like a Goldilocks kind of approach. Finding that medium fit is where you as experts can find best, but there is no specific algorithm or proportion or ratio for spacing. Thanks. How many repetitions of math facts do students need? The more, the better. At least 3. But thanks for these questions. And if I'm going to, how's the pacing? Am I going okay? Okay. All right. I'll keep going. What's your favorite way of introducing retrieval practice strategies to teachers with little expertise? Trivia questions. Trivia questions gets everyone in the mindset of, oh, I know that, and that feels comfortable, and that's not graded. And usually at pub trivia, you're winning beer and pizza. Like trivia questions feel very comfortable for many people. So if you've seen my keynotes on YouTube or in person, I hope, you've seen that I often start with a trivia question about bones. Does anyone know the correct number of bones in the human body? You can type it into the chat. How many bones do we have in the human body? 206. Yeah. And I love the question mark, question mark, question mark. It's 206. That's retrieval practice. It gets us all warmed up as teachers, just like we do in our classes. So that's how I introduce retrieval practice to teachers. Literally the first day, the first 5 minutes of any type of professional development that I do. And then I like to intersperse it. I space it out. So just to give us a little mental break, I'll put the trivia question in the middle of a keynote and then at the end of the keynote. It works really well to have trivia questions that have a number or a year or one word, because then by the end, you kind of have this like chorus singing 206, and it's this really satisfying drop mic moment. But it's also a great way to frame how forgetting happens, how learning happens. You remember this trivia fact. Hopefully, if you ever come across the number of bones in the body, you'll remember, oh, I saw that workshop with Dr. Agarwal. So I love introducing it with just a trivia fact. I do that with my students. I ask them the number of seats in our auditorium. It's a great strategy if you work with parents or have a parents' night in K-12 to start with a trivia question as well. Once information is embedded in the long-term memory through retrieval practice, can information be lost if it's not used? Yes, forgetting happens. I am surprised that I cannot ride a bike. I know people talk about how learning, when you forget something, it's like riding a bike. Literally, I can't I can't really ride a bike. I grew up riding a bike. I know how to ride a bike. I haven't ridden a bike really in about 20 years. And I tried to ride a bike 6 months ago. And I found, this is so embarrassing. I found that I could only turn left. There was something about turning right on a bicycle that felt really weird to me. And I dance, so I have a good center of balance, but I literally can't ride a bicycle anymore. So, yeah, there are things embedded in long-term memory, whether it's what we call semantic memory, facts, names, dates, or it's episodic memory, stories from vacation or movies or books, or it's procedural memory, riding a bike, driving a car. Um, and I can't really ride a bike. Now, if I practice it, it will come back to me. I also grew up playing violin for 10 years. I can't read sheet music anymore. I haven't played the violin in 30 years, and I can't read sheet music. So there are definitely things that we think I'm always going to know that, and we forget it. And that's a normal part of the human experience is learning and forgetting. How can you measure the impact of retrieval practice across a school? I think a simple way is a survey, is a questionnaire, is to just ask teachers and ask students, how do you feel about retrieval practice? And do you think it's improving your learning? That's a really simple one. And even though I'm very much a quantitative researcher, I like my numbers and data, even just getting that survey information can be really informative. Especially from students, I ask them, do you think retrieval practice is helping you learn? And I ask them that in the middle of the semester, not just at the end. And it helps them reflect on the process. And they, I would say for the most part, and they know me well enough to know that they don't need to suck up to me. They know me well enough that they can be honest and say no, but most of them say yes. So asking students, even if they're fourth graders or they're 30-year-olds, ask them, has this strategy helped you? And ask teachers, have you noticed a difference in your classroom can be really helpful. Of course, you could have all students in your entire school do a brain dump and then have teachers look at those brain dumps. Do they seem more rich with more facts or critical thinking than what teachers have seen previously? You could also look at grades. Have grades currently, now that you've implemented retrieval practice, changed since what you've seen in the past? Um, Doing a whole school integration of strategies and research, I would love to help with that. So please feel free to reach out because we need more research in schools. We've got 100 years of laboratory research. To me, that's now kind of, I mean, important, but outdated. I want to know what works in the real world. I had a newsletter about how there's been a large increase in applied research in real schools since 2010. I really encourage looking at research from 2010 or more recent. For the most part, if you find any research cited before 2010 on retrieval practice, it was conducted in lab settings, not in real schools. So if you're interested in doing research across your whole school, please let me know. Can you suggest a course I can take to learn more about cognitive science? Yes. Uh, there are a number of courses on the science of learning. To my knowledge, there's only one that has been created by a cognitive scientist, and that is a course on LinkedIn by my colleague, Dr. Janelle Blunt. So let's see, on LinkedIn Learning, if you go to retrievalpractice.org/scientists, I spelled that correctly. Go to retrievalpractice.org/scientists. Click on Dr. Janelle Blunt's profile, and that has a link to her LinkedIn Learning course. That course is geared toward professionals of all different fields and areas, not just education. But she knows her stuff. She has done research in this field and she teaches. So Dr. Blunt's chapter is the very first one in the book on retrieval practice. She is a world expert on retrieval, and I highly recommend her LinkedIn Learning course. You can also reach out to her directly. Her email address is there on her profile as well. But check out her course. There are many others, but I think there is deep value in getting research straight from the source from scientists who know what it's like to collect data and to analyze it and to publish it and to teach using it. Evidence-based tips for neurodiverse learners and ADHD. Yes, Barbara Oakley's Learning How to Learn is great. Learning in the Brain, if anyone will be at Learning in the Brain in Boston in November, I will be stopping by. I will be giving out free copies of Powerful Teaching. So shoot me an email and we'll meet up. But Barb Oakley does have a keynote at Learning in the Brain. I'm not speaking, but I live in Boston, so I'm just going to come hang out. So hers is great. I will say she's not a cognitive scientist. Her background is in engineering and math. Okay, neurodiverse learners. I think if you go to neurodiversity, if you go to retrievalpractice.org/neurodiversity, or it might be neurodiverse, if someone can check. I can tell from your eyeballs that some of you are clicking on the link. So let me know if that link works. I've got a newsletter where I looked up, I did kind of an informal literature review. And I linked to a bunch of research articles about how retrieval practice improves learning for students with ADHD, students with developmental disability, developmental language disorders, students with dyslexia. Retrieval practice consistently improves learning for neurodiverse learners, for students in special education programs as well. I'm going to grab my dog real quick because she's awake and running around. So let me grab her, but let me know if that link did or didn't work. Feel free to put in anything in the chat that you like for resources as well. But let me grab my dog. Okay, as promised, this is Fiona. She's 16 years old. I adopted her 2 years ago. She's mostly deaf. She likes to sleep and she really likes chicken. Well, that's Fiona. So you'll often find her, or I will often find her asleep under my desk when I'm writing the newsletters. Yeah, so evidence-based tips for students who are neurodiverse, retrieval, spacing, it all seems to work. You may need to adjust things depending on their learning disabilities. You're the experts and you know how to do that best, but retrieval improves their learning as well. Oh gosh, 20 minutes. Okay, we'll see how many more I can get through. I see many students enjoy YouTube videos when it comes to revising or studying in biology. Why do I think these videos are useful? Yes, and someone had submitted this in the Zoom registration as well. Thank you. One reason why I think videos are helpful are because students can pause them and go back and re-listen and look at them with captions and go back to them again. And with the crash course videos, they're probably maybe going to be more engaging than me. They're high production value for certain YouTube videos. Students love TikTok. My students are all on TikTok. I didn't grow up with social media or YouTube. And I kind of wish I had. I sat through a lot of boring lectures in college. I think there are advantages to YouTube videos. 40% of my students are English language learners, students who are from all over the world who are learning English, and they really appreciate YouTube videos. They can go at their own pace. As much as I can adjust my pace with speaking during class, watching a YouTube video gives students agency to change the pace for themselves. It also reminds me, I use live captions in all of my classes, all of them. I highly recommend using live captions. They're embedded now in Google Slides and PowerPoint. I think in Google Slides, the keyboard shortcut on a Mac is Command-Shift-C. And I think the keyboard shortcut on PowerPoint is J. Like when you're in slideshow mode, if you just push J, try it out. I think that's the keyboard shortcut for captions. And again, for Google Slides, I think it's Command-Shift-C. But just Google live captions for Google Slides or PowerPoint. And I think that really helps my students as well, is to be able to see those captions. I use them for professional development, keynotes, workshops as well. Yes, lots of bad information on YouTube as well. That's why I specify to my students, watch these videos. These are the ones required, not find a video on mitosis, because that's going to be full of stuff. Or find a video about the psychology of sleep. There's so many misconceptions about power naps, for example. So if you can choose the YouTube videos for them, that can be really, really helpful for them. And yes, the benefits of dual coding as well. We know that as much as learning styles are appealing, they're a myth. Students learn best when they learn in a lot of different ways. So if they can see drawings and diagrams on YouTube that I don't necessarily put up on the screen in my classes, being able to see that and hear that and watch it as well can be helpful. How do you use retrieval practice with teaching history? Oh, there's so much there. Of course, retrieving not just facts from history, but stories are a great part of history. I remember when in college I was getting certified to be an elementary ed teacher, and I took a methods class for teaching history, and I literally like cried. The first day of this methods class, I was so nervous about teaching history because I, at the time, hated history. It was one of those classes that was so dry, that was so boring to me, that I was so scared to teach it. And I've since learned history is really cool, especially when you dig into some of the historical stories. So asking students to retrieve stories, there's names, dates, facts, asking them to interleave. Oftentimes history is taught chronologically. And we know a basic human pattern of learning is we remember the beginning of things and the end of things and not the middle. My favorite movie is The Princess Bride. I can picture the beginning and the end. I know what happens for the rest of the movie, but it's all kind of jumbled in my head. If students are learning history chronologically, they're going to remember the first few presidents, the most recent presidents, and not the presidents in the middle. So using interleaving with history, as well as math and science and literature, can also be very beneficial for their learning. If you had to choose one of your books for a higher education FLC, faculty learning community, which one would you select? Please, please, I select this one. Smart Teaching, Stronger Learning. I'm really proud of it. Powerful Teaching, of course, my first book with Patrice Bain, who is a K-12 teacher, is wonderful. Um, I conducted research with the authors of Make It Stick for 20 years. The author Henry Roediger was my PhD advisor. And so in Powerful Teaching, Patrice Bain and I wanted to take essentially the research I had done with the authors of Make It Stick and make it more practical. So Powerful Teaching has a great mix of research with teaching strategies. There are many reasons why I really like our newer book, Smart Teaching, Stronger Learning. One, it's updated. Make It Stick is now 10 years old. Powerful Teaching is 6 years old. Smart Teaching, Stronger Learning includes publications that were literally published 6 months ago. So the research is up to date. It's full of practical strategies. Every chapter is written by a scientist who's a teacher. They all teach. So you get teaching strategies that are practical and it's short. I can't emphasize enough, like I don't read books very often because I have a lot on my plate. So I love that it's short and it's practical. If you want to go more in depth for an FLC, Powerful Teaching is great. I have a list of more books at uh, retrievalpractice.org/books. There's a link at retrieval. Oh, sorry if that doesn't work. There's a link at, thanks, Max. I do like our book. There's a link there at retrievalpractice.org/books to Bookshop. That has a more updated list. Sometimes I've been slower to update my website. So find the link to Bookshop, and I've got a link there. On Bookshop, you can order books from independent bookstores. They get profits. And so you get to choose the bookstore who gets a certain amount of proceeds, and you still get the book shipped to you. So I highly encourage you to look at Bookshop. And yeah, please, please, I recommend Smart Teaching, Stronger Learning. It's shorter, it's up to date, it's more digestible. Oh, and especially for FLCs, each chapter has two recommended further readings that I myself selected. And so for an FLC, for example, you could have, and a PLC in K-12 as well, for any learning community, you could have educators read a chapter and read one or both of the recommended readings. Same with if you're teaching college or graduate students in psychology or education classes. That's why we put two additional readings so that you can dig into it more if you'd like to. Okay, how do you apply these concepts to professional learning situations where you don't have ongoing interactions? This is tough. This is where professional development is often one and done. Following up takes effort, but following up with a newsletter, an email. I really like the start, stop, keep framework. So I might email after workshops, I'll email teachers I connected with and say, so what have you started, stopped, or kept after this workshop or keynote? That's why I like my newsletter, honestly, is because I get to send people fresh ideas and keep them updated. There's so many Substacks you could recommend people follow. FLC, faculty learning communities, are a great way to keep the conversation going as well. But if you don't have ongoing interactions, that can be hard. Sometimes I send newsletters and it feels like it goes into a void. So I love getting emails from you all. I really do, because I don't know who's opening them or who's um, implementing the strategies in their classroom. So I don't have ongoing interactions with my newsletter subscribers. But trying to check in with people, I think, makes a big difference. It makes a really, really big difference. So I don't have a solution to that. Social media, of course, can help with that as well. I think that's why the most impact you can make in the moment is the most powerful. Giving small strategies that are easy for teachers to implement so that if you don't have ongoing interactions, hopefully you've imparted strategies that continue to make a difference. How do we help students learn when they're under pressure from a standardized test or exam? Oh, I just talked with my students about this week, and I talk about it in the first week of class. Students are going to cram. And you know why? Because cramming works. Plenty of research shows cramming improves short-term learning. We can't get mad at our students for cramming for standardized tests or exams. They're going to cram and they're doing what's in line with research because it improves their short-term learning. That's where I encourage my students to still use more effective strategies like two things or brain dumps because it will improve their short-term learning and their long-term learning. Flashcards are great. I have tips for flashcards at retrievalpractice.org/flashcards, I think. I've also got retrievalpractice.org slash, this is really hard, students. Retrievalpractice.org/students. There I've got recommended blogs, podcasts, YouTube videos, books. I've got resources for my good friends and colleagues, the learning scientists, if you go to learningscientists.org. But students can still use retrieval, spacing, interleaving while they study. They just tend to revert to old habits. We all do that. Humans are creatures of habit. Trying to model for students two things in your classroom so maybe they can use it outside at home as a study strategy can be beneficial. I think I maybe have time for just a few more. How do I practice self-care? Oh, thanks for asking. Well, I talk a lot about research on well-being with my students' physical and mental well-being, so I exercise and sleep, and I try to prioritize those. There's so much research on the benefits of exercise and sleep. I didn't exercise this week, so it doesn't always happen, but I do prioritize sleep. Spending time with friends, spending time with my dog. I enjoy dancing. And I regularly FaceTime with friends. I have two friends who I FaceTime with every Monday at 3 and another one every Friday at 4, so that I can keep up with social interactions. That's just in our schedule, and I don't get to see them in person very often. So that's important to me as part of my well-being. And I also just watch Netflix. Like I said in my newsletter, that's okay. I'll watch hours of Netflix. I did yesterday, and I mentioned my newsletter, I finished the Ed Gein story on Netflix, and last night I finished the Jeffrey Dahmer story. Brian, I see you nodding. So they're good. So if self-care includes enjoying some TV in the evening, I do that as well. How did I first get interested in cognitive science? A combination of essentially a light bulb moment in college. I was training to get certified in elementary ed, and I was also majoring in psychology, and it just felt like the two fields never talked and never met. In my classes on teaching, we talked about learning. In my psych classes, we talked about research on learning, but there was just this huge disconnect. And it really was one of these college situations where I thought, well, I think I can help address that problem. We just need to build some more bridges. I also took a cognitive psychology class in college, and I had no idea that people did research on learning. And I still remember that professor. I'll be seeing him next month at a conference, and it was really a formative experience in college. So I try to keep that in mind with my college students that I think and hope I'm having an impact on the rest of their lives. And we all are as educators. We're doing that for our students, which means a lot. I wanted to share a few things before we wrap up, and maybe I can go back to a few more questions. Here are QR codes to my books that I hope you'll check out if you haven't already. Powerful Teaching and Smart Teaching, Stronger Learning. Again, both are available in paperback. Um, I mean, Powerful Teaching might still be available in hardback, but I'll be giving away free hardback ones in November at Learning in the Brain in Boston. But they're in paperback, ebook, Kindle, and Audible has Powerful Teaching, and they will have Smart Teaching, Stronger Learning soon. I have tons of free resources for both books. I totally understand as teachers not being able to spend money. So please check out my free resources on my website. Here are more QR codes if you want, or you can take a screenshot. Again, I've got my more than 100 free resources in a Google Drive folder in my library. There's the QR code to more books I recommend and the tips for students that I mentioned as well. Uh, oh, Oh, I accidentally clicked on it. There you go. So let me make this back. Oh, see, and sometimes that happens with my students, right? Where it just kind of exits out, especially with Slido. So let me go back to that. There we go. A few things I wanted to mention. Please help support our work as scientists who are teachers. We all do, including me, virtual and in-person keynotes and workshops. All of the funds from those speaking events goes toward making these free resources, my free newsletter, and all of that. So we really appreciate being able to visit your schools and talk with educators. So please spread the word that we do that. I do a lot of professional development for all grade levels, and I should have mentioned graduate schools as well, medical schools. Please tell a friend about my newsletter. Thank you all for being subscribers and for this newsletter exclusive Ask Me Anything. Please tell your friends to subscribe. I am intentionally not on social media much, another form of self-care and well-being. So you'll see me kind of like put things out on Blue Sky and LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, but I don't really interact much on social media. My newsletter is where my thoughts and ideas are really focused on. So please tell your friends. If you've bought or read Smart Teaching, Stronger Learning, please help rate or review it on Amazon. It's kind of an icky favor to ask, but it really does help get the book into the hands of teachers. So please do consider going to Amazon to rate or review the book. I think a great way to review the book is to put in your favorite tip in the review so that people are getting free tips about teaching in the reviews. So please consider doing that. Here's a Slido poll for you. If you could hop onto Slido, slido.com, hashtag retrieve. What's a key takeaway for you from today's Ask Me Anything? And why is it memorable for you? So we'll do some retrieval practice with our few minutes left. What's a key takeaway for you from the Ask Me Anything? And I hope seeing how Slido works has been helpful. I'm a big fan of modeling retrieval practice during my keynotes and talks, during my courses, in my classes, my professional development for teachers. I'm a big fan of showing you how things work in hopes that you can adapt it for your classes as well. So what is a key takeaway? Oh, this one I have set. So you can see at the top that it says the number of participants typing. And in the top right of your screen, it says 2 people have submitted their responses so far. The first slide where I asked, how do you already use retrieval practice? That one was set to immediately show and pop up the responses. This one I have set to wait. So I can choose to click when I'd like to reveal the key takeaways. So in my classes with college students, depending on the question, I might want to do a big reveal on a click, or I might be okay with them just typing in and seeing other people's responses. So I'll give you about 30 more seconds to type in your key takeaway from today. And I want to give a shout out to you who is joining us from Japan. You has been on every single one of my Zoom parties from Japan with a 13-hour time difference. So or I think about 13 hours. So when we started, it was 6 in the morning for him. And I love that we have people from all over the world. So I'll show you what you all said. So some takeaways, feel free to keep typing. You just want to start slowly implementing retrieval practice and tracking progress. I love that idea and becoming more of a data collector day by day. I would love to quote that in my newsletter. So I thank you for that. My view on YouTube videos is helpful. Great. Yeah, I think there's a lot of research on YouTube. There's a lot of misconceptions about the optimal length of videos, but I'd love to know more. To continue retrieval practice, Dr. Janelle Blunt's course on LinkedIn Learning. Don't read and take notes. You're multi-failing and hearing more about ways to include retrieval practice. So again, I'm Dr. Pooja Agarwal. Thank you all so much for being subscribers. I always like to end class a little early because I will stick around and feel free to ask me some questions. But if you need to head out, feel free to head out. So thank you all so much for being here. And I'm happy to take any additional questions.